650 feet of Kansas dirt, shale, and limestone sat on top of my head. You do not think about the weight when you're down here. You cannot. If you let your mind drift to the geology, to the sheer crushing mathematics of the lithosphere pressing down on the salt strata, you'll lock up. You'll freeze. Your hands will start to shake, and you'll strip a bolt or drop a wrench into a fan assembly. Down here, in the Hutchinson salt member, panic was not just a weakness. It was an industrial accident waiting to happen. My name is Elias, and for the last 5 years, I've been the senior environmental systems technician for the underground vaults and storage facility. While the world above burned in the summer heat or froze in the winter blizzards, my world was a constant, manufactured 68 degrees with a relative humidity of 40%. I was currently waist-deep in the guts of Air Handler Unit 7, a massive sheet metal lung tasked with breathing for Section D, the archive sector holding roughly 10 million reels of Hollywood film stock. The machine had been complaining for a week, a high-pitched harmonic whine that most people would not hear, but to me, it sounded like a dying animal. The drive belt tensioner. It had to be. I adjusted the beam of my headlamp, the cone of white light cutting through the absolute, crushing blackness of the maintenance crawlspace. The air here did not smell like earth. It smelled like brine and ozone, a dry, metallic tang that coated the back of your throat and preserved everything it touched. That was the selling point. The salt sucked the moisture out of the air, keeping the film dry, the paper crisp, and the machines running, until the bearings dried out. I reached into the tool bag hanging off the catwalk railing. My fingers brushed the cold chrome of a 3/4-inch box-end wrench. I gripped it, feeling the textured steel against my grease-stained gloves. The tensioner bolt was seized. Of course it was. Even in a climate-controlled mine, galvanic corrosion was a patient enemy. I set the wrench on the bolt head, feeling for the bite. There was a satisfying tactile lock as the steel jaws gripped the hex head. I applied pressure, bracing my boot against the housing of the blower motor. The metal groaned, a low, friction-heavy creak that vibrated through the handle of the wrench and into my palm. It was the sound of torque fighting rust. I exhaled a sharp breath through my nose, leaning my weight into it. The bolt gave way with a sharp, snapping sensation, a release of tension that sent a jolt up my elbow. I did not stop. I spun the wrench, listening to the dry rasp of the threads backing out. The old tensioner pulley wobbled on its shaft. I pulled it free, the metal warm to the touch from friction, and inspected the bearing. It was shot. The grease seal had ruptured, spewing black, viscous lubricant across the housing, leaving the ball bearings inside to grind themselves into metal dust. Garbage, I whispered to the empty tunnel. My voice did not echo. The salt walls, rough-hewn and crystalline, absorbed sound like acoustic foam. I grabbed a rag from my back pocket and began the cleanup. This was the job. It was not glorious. It was wiping down steel surfaces, checking tolerances, and ensuring that the millions of dollars of corporate history stored in the dark did not rot. I took the new tensioner from its box, peeling away the wax paper wrapper. It smelled of fresh machine oil, a clean, orderly scent. I lined up the new part, threading the bolt by hand first to ensure I did not cross-thread the mount. The steel threads meshed smooth as silk. I tightened it down, then reached for the belt. It was a heavy-duty V-belt, reinforced with Kevlar cord. I looped it over the motor sheave and the fan pulley, feeling the resistance of the rubber. That was when the rhythm of the mine changed. It was not a sound. It was a lack of one. The constant subsonic thrum of the main ventilation boosters, Huge, industrial fans located a mile away near the primary intake shaft cut out. The silence that followed was physically heavy. It pressed against my eardrums, a sudden vacuum of background noise that I had lived with for half a decade. The vibration in the floor, a subtle tremble that confirmed the mine was alive and breathing, vanished. I froze, my hand still gripping the V-belt. Then the lights died. The overhead sodium vapor bulbs that ran the length of the main haulage tunnel did not just fade, they extinguished instantly, plunging the world outside my headlamp into a darkness so complete it felt like a liquid. A second later, the emergency relays clicked. It was a dry, mechanical sound, like a firing pin on an emptied chamber. The battery-backed emergency floods flickered on, dim, yellow eyes spaced 50 yards apart down the tunnel, casting long, jagged shadows against the salt pillars. Power surge, I muttered, trying to rationalize the dread spiking in my chest. Grid brownout. But the intake fans had not restarted. That was the problem. The backup generators on the surface should have kicked in within 10 seconds. I counted in my head. 10, 20, 30. Silence. Absolute, suffocating silence. I finished tightening the tensioner bolt. It was a reflex. Finish the job. Secure the system. I checked the tension on the belt, pushing down with my thumb. Half an inch of deflection. Perfect. I packed my tools, slotting the wrench and the dead pulley back into the canvas bag. I zipped it shut, the sound of the brass teeth meshing together seemingly loud enough to wake the dead. I climbed down from the service platform, my boots crunching on the loose salt covering the floor. I walked over to the tunnel wall where the hardline intercom phone hung in a yellow, dust-proof box. I lifted the receiver. Usually there was a dial tone or the faint crosstalk of the security team at the surface desk complaining about the coffee. Now there was nothing. Not even static. Just a dead, void space where a connection should be. I tapped the cradle hook. Surface, this is Thorne in Section D. Main power is down. Ventilation is down. Generators have not kicked. Do you copy? I waited. I listened so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my own carotid artery, a rhythmic whooshing sound behind my ears. Surface, this is Thorne. Report. Nothing. I hung up the phone. The plastic handset clattered against the box, a hollow, lonely noise. I looked down the tunnel. Section D was a mile and a half from the main shaft, the skip that ferried men and equipment to the surface. I had my electric cart, a battered orange utility buggy powered by a bank of lead-acid batteries parked 20 feet away. I walked to the cart, threw my tool bag into the passenger seat, and turned the key. The solenoid clicked, and the display lit up. 84% charge. Good. The electric motor whined as I accelerated, the tires crunching over the salt. The cart had headlights, but they were weak compared to the darkness of the mine. I drove through the corridors of the underworld, passing the sealed vaults. On my left and right, massive steel doors guarded rooms filled with medical records, oil surveys, and reels of the Wizard of Oz. The mine was a grid, a city of salt pillars left behind to hold up the roof. It was easy to get lost if you did not know the landmarks. I navigated by the specific cracks in the ceiling, the color of the rock dust, and the number tags bolted to the pillars. As I drove, the air began to feel different, stagnant. Without the forced ventilation, the heat from the equipment and the latent geothermal warmth would eventually start to rise, but for now, it was the stillness that unnerved me. The air did not move. It hung suspended, heavy and waiting. I reached the intersection marking the transition from the storage facility to the active mining corridors. The facility was huge, hundreds of miles of tunnels, but only a small portion was conditioned for storage. The rest was dark, abandoned territory. I turned left, heading toward the Shaft Number 2 station. The ride took 15 minutes. In that time, I did not see a single soul. There were 3 other guys on the graveyard shift, Miller in security and 2 logistics guys, Ramirez and O'Malley, who were supposed to be cataloging in Zone B. "Miller?" I called out as I approached the security kiosk near the elevator shaft. The kiosk was empty. A cup of coffee sat on the desk, cold. A paperback book was face down on the open page. I killed the cart's motor. The silence rushed back in, immediate and aggressive. I walked to the shaft gates. The hoist was a massive double-deck cage suspended by steel cables thick as a man's arm. It was our lifeline. The only way in, the only way out. The gate was closed. I pressed the call button. I could hear the contact close inside the panel, a tiny metallic tick. But the heavy industrial contactors that drove the winch motor did not fire. I grabbed the mesh of the gate and rattled it. The steel barrier shook, the noise ringing out harsh and discordant. "Hey!" I shouted up the shaft. The voice traveled up, swallowed by the darkness of the vertical tunnel. I pulled my flashlight from my belt, a heavy tactical LED unit, and shone it through the grate, aiming upward. The beam cut through the dust motes, illuminating the grease-slicked guide rails and the blackened timber supports. The cables were there. They hung straight and true, disappearing into the blackness above. But they were still, vibrationless. I moved to the manual lockout panel next to the gate. I needed to know if the power cut was local or total. I pulled my multimeter from my pocket, flipped the dial to AC voltage, and jammed the probes into the test terminals of the control box. 0. 0 volts. Dead. Completely dead. I switched the meter to verify continuity on the emergency signal line. Open loop. The line was severed. My stomach did a slow, sickening roll. The cables for the emergency phone and the control signals ran inside the shaft. If the line was open, it meant something had physically broken the connection between here and the surface. I stepped back from the gate, wiping a layer of salt dust from my forehead. My mind raced, running through the schematics of the mine's infrastructure. The air. That was the first priority. Stratica was a deep mine. We did not have to worry about explosive methane like the coal miners in West Virginia, but we had CO2. Pockets of carbon dioxide could seep out of the rock. Without ventilation, the CO2 would pool in the low spots. It was heavier than oxygen. It would fill the floor like invisible water. And we generated heat. Without the exhaust fans, the temperature would creep up. But oxygen was the killer. I needed to find the others. I climbed back into the cart and spun it around, the tires squealing on the smooth salt floor. I floored the accelerator, heading for Zone B. "Ramirez! O'Malley!" I shouted as I drove, my voice cracking slightly. I found the logistics cart parked outside Vault 44. It was empty. The vault door was open. I grabbed my wrench. It felt better to have steel in my hand, and walked into the vault. The rows of cardboard boxes stacked on pallets stretched back into the gloom. "Yo, you guys in here?" A sound came from the back of the bay, a scuffing noise, like leather dragging on concrete. I moved toward it, weaving through the pallets. "Power's out, boys. We need to regroup at the maintenance bay. We've got to." I rounded the corner of a stack of medical records and stopped. Ramirez was there. He was standing by the back wall, staring at a patch of salt that looked wet. Ramirez? He turned slowly. His face was pale, drained of blood in the harsh light of my headlamp. He did not look at me. He looked through me. "The phone did not work," Ramirez whispered. "I know. The lines are cut." "Where's O'Malley?" Ramirez pointed a trembling finger toward the dark, unlit corridor that led to the old, abandoned section of the mine. "He heard something. He went to check." "He went into the dark? Without a cart?" He said he heard the wind." I stepped closer to Ramirez, grabbing his shoulder. The fabric of his uniform shirt was damp with sweat. "Listen to me. The fans are off. There is no wind. If he heard wind, it's a pressure equalization. It means a breach." "A breach?" Ramirez's eyes widened. "Like water? Maybe. Or a collapse." The thought chilled me more than the 68-degree air. A collapse in a salt mine was not like a rock mine. Salt was plastic. It flowed over time. But if the overburden gave way—
"We need to get O'Malley, and we need to get to the maintenance bay," I said, my voice dropping into the command tone I used when training apprentices. "The bay has the bottled water, the rebreathers, and the only hardline connection to the seismic sensors. We need data." "I cannot go in there," Ramirez said, backing away. "You do not have a choice. Get in the cart." I did not wait for him to argue. I shoved him toward the exit. He stumbled, but moved. I looked down the dark corridor where O'Malley had gone. It was known as the Old Dark. Mining drifts from the 1950s, unstable and unmapped on the modern charts. "O'Malley!" I screamed. The sound died instantly. No echo, just the salt absorbing the energy. I could not go after him, not without backup, not without a tagline. Rule number 1 of mine safety: do not create 2 victims. I turned and marched back to the cart. Ramirez was huddled in the passenger seat, shivering. We drove back to the maintenance bay, located centrally near the main junction. It was a cage within a cave, a fenced-off area with chain-link walls and a heavy sliding gate stocked with tools, parts, and safety gear. I pulled the cart inside and slid the heavy steel gate shut. I threw the latch and engaged the padlock. It was a psychological barrier more than a physical one, but the click of the shackle locking gave me a momentary sense of control. "Okay," I said, turning to Ramirez. "Inventory, now." I began tearing through the lockers. Water. We had 3 5-gallon jugs on the cooler and 2 cases of bottles in the corner. Roughly 25 gallons. 2 people. Rationed strictly. That was 2 weeks. Maybe 3. Food. The vending machines in the break room next door. I'd have to smash them open. Candy bars, chips, some beef jerky. Not great, but calories. Light. I checked the battery locker. We had 6 heavy lantern batteries, a dozen boxes of AA's, and 4 spare headlamps. Air. This was the big one. I pulled the case of self-contained self-rescuers, SCSRs, from the shelf. These were chemical oxygen generators. You clamp them on your nose and bite the mouthpiece, and they give you 1 hour of breathable air to escape a fire or gas pocket. We had 10 of them. 10 hours of mobile air. But we were not mobile. We were static. I walked over to the environmental monitoring station on the workbench. It was powered by a dedicated UPS, separate from the mine grid. The small LCD screen was glowing green in the dark. I tapped the keys, bringing up the sensor readings for our sector. O2, 20, 9%, normal. CO2, 450 ppm, normal. CO, 0 ppm. Normal. Temp, 68.2 Fahrenheit. The air was still good. For now. "What are we doing?" Ramirez asked from the corner. He was sitting on a bucket of hydraulic fluid, holding his head in his hands. "We're digging in," I said, unrolling a set of blueprints on the workbench.
I weighted the corners down with a wrench, a hammer, and a heavy brass valve. "Why is not anyone coming?" "They might be," I lied. "But if the hoist is broken, they have to rig the emergency cage. That takes time. Or they have to drill a rescue shaft. That takes days." I traced the lines in the blueprint with my dirty fingernail. We were in Section D. The air intake was at Shaft 1. The exhaust was at Shaft 4. Both were miles away.
"Elias," Ramirez said, his voice trembling. "Do you smell that?" I paused, lifting my head. I sniffed the air. Underneath the salt and the ozone, there was something else. Faint. Earthy. It smelled like wet soil. Salt mines do not smell like soil. They are hermetically sealed geological tombs. If you smell soil, it means the outside world is getting in. "Yeah," I said softly. "I smell it." I grabbed a roll of duct tape and a sheet of heavy plastic sheeting we used for asbestos abatement. "What is it?" "It's a draft," I said. "From the old dark." I moved to the back of the cage, where the chain link met the rough salt wall. I used the tape to seal the seam between the plastic and the rock, creating a makeshift barrier against the draft. "We need to conserve heat," I said, though that was not the real reason. "And we need to keep the dust out." I did not tell him that if I could smell soil, it meant the overburden had breached somewhere.
And if the overburden had breached, the water would follow. And in a salt mine, the water was the ultimate destroyer. It dissolved the very pillars holding up the roof. I finished taping the plastic. The sound of the tape ripping off the roll, a harsh, tearing noise, was the only sound in the room. I stood back, wiping my hands on my pants. I looked at the dark tunnel beyond our cage lights. We were 650 feet down. The elevator was dead. The phone was dead. One man was missing in the unmapped dark. And the smell of wet grave dirt was drifting in from the deep tunnels. I picked up the 3/4-inch wrench again. I weighed it in my hand. It was solid. Real. "Ramirez," I said, "grab the bolt cutters. We're going to the break room to harvest the vending machine. Then we're welding this gate shut." "Welding it?" "Yeah. We're not just waiting for rescue anymore." I looked at the black void beyond the fence. "We're securing the perimeter." The decision to weld the gate was the first casualty of my new reality. I had the oxyacetylene cart pulled halfway across the stained concrete floor of the maintenance bay before the math caught up with me. It was not the fuel that stopped me. We had 2 full K-tanks of acetylene. It was the oxygen. Combustion is a thief. An oxy-fuel torch consumes oxygen from the tank to burn the fuel, but it also devours the ambient air to sustain the reaction once the metal hits kindling temperature. In a sealed environment with zero ventilation, lighting a torch was effectively suffocating ourselves in fast forward. I stood there, gripping the rubber handle of the cart, staring at the brass regulators. "Change of plans," I said, my voice flat. No fire. Ramirez was standing by the workbench, holding a pair of 36-inch bolt cutters like a religious talisman. He looked at the torch, then at me. "But you said," "I know what I said. But if I light this, we burn the air we need to breathe. We secure the gate mechanically, drills, bolts, and chain." I released the cart. It settled with a heavy metallic rattle of wheels against concrete. "The vending machines first," I ordered. "We need the calories before we burn them." We moved to the break room adjacent to the maintenance bay. It was a sterile white box with a drop ceiling and a flickering fluorescent tube that was running off the last dregs of the emergency ballast. The vending machine was a glass-fronted monolith filled with bright, crinkling wrappers. I did not smash the glass. Glass shards in a survival situation are just landmines waiting for a careless hand or a knee. Infection down here, in the salt and dust, would be slow and necrotic. Instead, I used a flathead screwdriver and a heavy ball-peen hammer. I jammed the tip of the screwdriver into the barrel lock on the right side of the machine. I choked up on the hammer handle, feeling the balance of the hickory wood. I struck the screwdriver. The impact sent a sharp vibration up my forearm, a dull, physical shock that traveled through the bone. I struck it again, and again. The metal of the lock cylinder was soft zinc alloy. It deformed under the hardened steel of the screwdriver. With a final, heavy blow, the cylinder sheared. The locking mechanism released with a groan of tortured metal. I pulled the door open. It swung wide, heavy and unbalanced. "Bag it," I said. "Everything." We worked in silence. Ramirez swept rows of honey buns, potato chips, and peanut butter crackers into a heavy-duty trash bag. I did the mental arithmetic as he worked. A standard honey bun is roughly 500 calories. A bag of chips, maybe 250. We had 4 rows of buns, 6 rows of chips, 5 rows of candy bars. Rough estimate, 40,000 calories, divided by 2 men, assuming a basal metabolic rate of 2,000 calories just to keep warm and moving. 10 days of food, maybe 15 if we starved ourselves. "The sodas too?" Ramirez asked. "Especially the sodas. Sugar and fluid. We do not leave a drop." We hauled the loot back to the maintenance cage. I felt the primal, hoarding instinct taking root in my gut. It was a cold, tight knot of possession. This was ours. We turned our attention to the gate. Since I could not weld it, I had to bolt it. The gate was a sliding chain-link barrier on a steel track. It had a simple latch, but a latch could be broken with a pry bar. I needed to make it part of the wall. I went to the raw materials rack in the back of the bay. We had lengths of perforated steel angle iron, unistrut. It was the erector set of the industrial world. I grabbed 3 10-foot lengths of deep channel strut. "Drill," I said, pointing to the yellow DeWalt cordless impact driver on the bench, and the box of half-inch bolts, 3-inch length. We positioned the unistrut across the opening of the gate, spanning from the fixed fence post to the sliding frame. I held the steel in place, my shoulder pressed against the cold metal, feeling the bite of the edges through my coveralls. "Drive it," I grunted. Ramirez slotted a bolt through the perforation in the strut and into the mesh of the fence. He fumbled with the backing plate, a square washer with teeth designed to grip the channel. The impact driver whirred, a high-pitched mechanical shriek that cut the silence. The hammer mechanism inside the drill engaged, tack, 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 driving the bolt home. The torque twisted Ramirez's wrist, but he held on. We put 6 bolts in each rail, top, middle, bottom. When we were done, the gate was not just locked, it was structurally fused to the doorframe. You would need a vehicle to breach it. I stepped back, wiping sweat from my eyes. The air in the cage was already feeling thicker. It was psychosomatic, I told myself. The sensors on the bench still read 29% oxygen, but the stillness was heavy. "Now," I said, turning to the real problem. "We build the lungs." The mine was a dead space. Without the main fans, the air was not moving.
Carbon dioxide is about 1.5 times denser than air. In a stagnant room, it sinks. It pools in the low spots. If we slept on the floor, we might never wake up. We needed circulation. We needed to pull the bad air from the floor and mix it, or scrub it. Ramirez, pull the batteries from the cart. All of them. They're heavy, Elias. I know. Do not tip them. Sulfuric acid loves eyeballs. While Ramirez wrestled with the battery compartment of the utility cart, I went to the HVAC parts locker. I needed a blower. I found a replacement centrifugal fan assembly for a VAV box. It was a squirrel cage blower, compact but powerful, designed to move about 400 cubic feet of air per minute. The problem was the motor. It was a 277-volt AC motor. Useless. We were on DC power now. I scanned the shelves. I needed a DC motor, something that could run off the cart batteries. My eyes landed on the scrap pile in the corner, the boneyard where we tossed parts that were broken but too valuable to throw away. Sticking out of a cardboard box was the radiator fan assembly from an old diesel forklift we had scrapped a year ago.
It was a large 12-volt DC fan with a shroud. High torque, high airflow. I dragged it onto the bench. The blades were covered in a layer of oily black dust, but the bearings spun freely when I flicked them with a finger. "Bring the batteries here," I called out. Ramirez lugged the lead-acid batteries over one by one. There were 6 of them. 6-volt, deep-cycle golf cart batteries. I looked at the configuration. The cart ran on a 36-volt system, 6 batteries in series. The fan I found was 12-volt. If I hooked that fan up to the full 36-volt string, the motor would spin at triple speed for about 10 seconds before the windings melted into a copper slag and caught fire. "We need to rewire the bank," I said, mostly to myself. I grabbed the wire strippers and a spool of 10-gauge stranded wire. "Ramirez, watch this. This is how we do not die." I pointed to the terminals. Series adds voltage. Parallel adds capacity. We have 6-volt batteries. We need 12 volts. I arranged the batteries on the floor in 3 pairs. We connect 2 6-volts in series, I demonstrated, bolting a jumper cable from the positive of one to the negative of the other. That makes one 12-volt unit. Then we do that 2 more times. I worked with the focus of a surgeon. A short circuit here would not just pop a breaker. With deep-cycle lead-acid batteries, a dead short could weld a wrench to the terminal instantly, or boil the acid inside the case until it exploded. I tightened the nuts on the terminals with a socket wrench. The sensation of the lead deforming slightly under the pressure of the steel nut was familiar, reassuring. It was the feeling of a good connection. Now I had 3 12-volt banks. I connected those 3 banks in parallel, positive to positive, negative to negative. "Massive capacity," I muttered. At 12 volts, this bank could run that fan for a week continuously. I stripped the ends of the fan motor wires. The copper was bright and clean. I crimped on heavy-duty ring terminals, crushing the metal sleeve onto the wire with the satisfying ratchet action of the crimping tool. I bolted the fan to the battery bank. The moment the final connection was made, the fan roared to life. It was not a gentle hum. It was a hungry, aggressive rush of air. The fan blades blurred into a gray disk, kicking up a cloud of salt dust from the workbench. "It works," Ramirez said, a rare smile breaking his panic. "Not yet," I said. "Moving air is not enough. We need to filter it." I turned to the stack of air filters I had pulled earlier. MERV 8 pleated filters. Standard stuff. Good for dust and pollen, useless for gas. But I had an idea. "The activated carbon," I said, snapping my fingers. For the water filtration system in the break room, We had a stash of replacement canisters for the under-sink water filter. They were filled with activated charcoal. Charcoal adsorbed organic compounds and some gases. It would not scrub CO2. Only specialized chemicals like soda lime or lithium hydroxide did that, but it would help with the smell, the dust, and any organic vapors coming from that wet soil breach. "Break them open," I ordered. We cracked the plastic casings of the water filters with a hammer, pouring the black, granular carbon into a pile on a sheet of plastic. I took 2 of the pleated air filters and laid them flat. I spread the charcoal granules sandwiched between them, creating a crude, carbon-impregnated filter sandwich. I used duct tape to seal the edges, wrapping the silver adhesive tightly around the cardboard frames. "High-fidelity engineering," I joked grimly. I taped the filter sandwich to the intake side of the radiator fan. The airflow dropped slightly as the resistance increased, the pitch of the fan deepening to a lower, laboring groan. I positioned the contraption on the floor, aimed upward at a 45-degree angle. "It pulls the heavy air from the floor," I explained, gesturing with a dirty hand. "Pushes it through the carbon, shoots it up toward the ceiling. It creates a convection current, keeps the air mixed, prevents the CO2 from settling on us while we sleep." It was a stopgap, a band-aid on a bullet wound. But as the air began to circulate, the stale, stagnant feeling in the cage began to dissipate. The breeze felt cool on my sweaty neck. I checked the sensor again. O2, 20. 8% CO2, 460 ppm. Holding steady. I sat down on an overturned bucket, my legs trembling from adrenaline withdrawal. I looked at the battery bank, the wires snaking out like veins, the fan humming its monotonous song. It was ugly. It was dangerous. It was beautiful. "Elias," Ramirez whispered. He was standing by the taped-up section of the chain-link fence, where the plastic sheeting was billowing slightly from the draft. "The smell," he said. "It's changed." I stood up, groaning as my knees popped. I walked over to him. The smell of wet soil was still there, but now it was sharper, acrid. "That's not soil," I said, leaning in, my nose inches from the plastic. I sniffed. A deep, lung-filling inhale. It smelled like rotten eggs and old pennies, hydrogen sulfide, and iron. "Rust," I said, "and swamp gas." I grabbed my flashlight and the bolt cutters. "We need to see what's happening out there. If that smell is getting stronger, the breach is opening up." "We cannot go out," Ramirez protested. "We just locked ourselves in." "We have a window," I said, pointing to the gap between the top of the cage and the ceiling. It was about 2 feet of clearance. "We can climb out, but we need to know what's coming down the tunnel." I climbed up the shelving unit, grunting as I hauled my weight up to the top of the cage. I lay on my stomach on top of the wire mesh, shining my light down the corridor toward the old dark. The beam cut through the darkness. At first I saw nothing but the salt pillars and the tire tracks of the carts. Then I saw the reflection. About 50 yards down the tunnel, the floor was black. Not shadow black. Glossy black. Water. It was creeping forward, a slow, silent tide. It was not rushing like a flood. It was oozing. "Water?" Ramirez asked from below. "Yeah, but it's wrong." I squinted. The water was moving, swirling with a viscosity that seemed too thick. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a large steel nut. I tossed it as hard as I could down the tunnel. It hit the black liquid with a sound that was not a splash. It was a thick, sucking plop. The liquid rippled,
heavy and sluggish. "It's sludge," I whispered. "Drilling mud? Or—" Then I saw the debris floating in it. It was not wood. It was not trash. It was a hard hat. A yellow hard hat, bobbing in the black ooze. "O'Malley," I breathed. The hat was spinning slowly in the current, and beneath it, something pale broke the surface of the black sludge for just a second before sinking back down. A hand. It was not moving, it was just floating. I scrambled backward, away from the edge of the cage, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "What?" Ramirez hissed. "What did you see?" I dropped back down to the floor of the cage, landing hard on my boots. I grabbed the duct tape. "Tape the seams," I ordered, my voice tight and low. "Every seam. The bottom of the plastic, the floor, the door cracks. Now." "Elias, what is it?" "It's not just water," I said, ripping a strip of tape with a violent tear. The shaft did not just break. It leaked. Something from the surface is coming down. And O'Malley found it first. I looked at the fan we had just built. It was pulling air from the floor. "Turn the fan around," I shouted. "Turn it around. Do not pull from the floor. Aim it at the door. Positive pressure." If that sludge was releasing gas, hydrogen sulfide, methane, or something worse, we were sucking it right into our lungs. I scrambled to the fan, kicking the battery bank aside. I grabbed the housing, feeling the heat of the motor, and physically spun it 180 degrees. "Push the air out," I yelled. "We need to keep that gas out of the cage." The fan was now blowing toward the taped-up wall, ballooning the plastic sheeting outward. It was a pathetic defense against the millions of tons of rock and whatever nightmare slurry was oozing down the corridor. But it was physics. Positive pressure kept contaminants out. I stood there, panting, watching the plastic sheet vibrate against the chain link. The smell of rotten eggs was getting stronger. I looked at the sensor. H2S, 2 ppm. Hydrogen sulfide. It was rising. At 100 ppm, it kills your sense of smell. At 500 ppm, you stop breathing. We were at 2. "Put the masks on," I said, reaching for the box of half-face respirators we used for painting. "The organic vapor cartridges, pink and yellow bands. Put them on now." I strapped the rubber mask to my face, pulling the elastic straps tight until they dug into my scalp. I inhaled. The air tasted like rubber and processed cotton, but the smell of the swamp vanished. I looked at Ramirez. He was fumbling with his straps, his eyes wide and wet with tears. "Tighten it," I mumbled through the exhaust valve. "Check the seal." I placed my hands over the intake filters of my mask and inhaled. The mask sucked against my face, creating a vacuum. Good seal. I sat down on the floor, my back against the heavy steel of the workbench. The fan droned on. The plastic sheet rippled. We had heat. We had water. We had a positive pressure system and a bolted gate. But out there, in the dark, the mine was filling up. And we were at the bottom of the drain. I looked at the multimeter connected to the battery bank. 12, 4 volts. We had power. We had time. But we did not have an exit. I closed my eyes for a second, listening to the fan. It was the only sound in the world, the heartbeat of our tomb. The numbers on the digital display were the only thing that mattered.
H2S, 28 ppm, 28 parts per million. It had been 4 hours since we barricaded the cage. The silence of the mine was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that pressed against the ringing in my ears. But the chemistry of the air was screaming. Hydrogen sulfide is an insidious killer. At 10 parts per million, it irritates the eyes and throat. At 50, it causes headaches and dizziness. At 100, it paralyzes the olfactory nerve. You stop smelling it, and you assume you're safe right before your lungs stop working. We were at 28 inside the cage. Outside, in the tunnel, it had to be double that, maybe triple. I sat on the concrete floor, staring at the sensor. The fan we had built was still screaming, the 12-volt motor spinning the modified blade at 3,000 RPM. It was pushing air, ballooning the plastic sheeting, fighting the invisible war of positive pressure. But it was losing. The source of the gas, the sludge creeping from the old dark, was putting out more volume than our makeshift scrubber could displace. We were bailing out a sinking boat with a teacup. "Elias," Ramirez croaked. His voice was muffled by the respirator. He was huddled in the corner, knees to his chest. "My eyes are burning."
"Do not rub them," I said, my own voice sounding distant and tinny inside my mask. "The gas reacts with the moisture in your tear ducts. It creates sulfuric acid. If you rub them, you grind the acid into the cornea." I stood up, my joints popping. The air in the cage was hazy, not with dust, but with a subtle, shimmering refraction. The heat from the battery bank and our bodies was fighting the cold dampness radiating from the tunnel. I walked to the plastic wall. The tape was holding, but the bottom edge, where we had sealed it to the floor, was dark. The moisture was wicking through the concrete. I placed my hand on the floor. It was cold, wet. "We cannot stay here," I said. Ramirez looked up. "You said this was the safest spot. You said we had time." "The variable changed," I said, pointing at the monitor. "At this rate of increase, we hit 50 ppm in an hour. 103. We'll pass out before the batteries die." "So we leave? Where do we go? The shaft is dead." "We do not leave," I corrected. "We stop the flow." I moved to the workbench and unrolled the blueprint again. My dirty fingerprint still marked our location. I traced the tunnel back toward the old dark, toward the breach. "Here," I said, tapping a symbol marked FD12. "Fire door 12. It's a ventilation control damper, a steel slider 6 inches thick, designed to seal Section D from the old mining grifts in case of a fire."
"It's open," Ramirez said. "It's always open. We keep it open for airflow, but if we close it, we seal the tunnel. We trap the gas and the sludge on the other side." "That's right next to where O'Malley—" Ramirez trailed off. "Yes, it's right at the junction, about 100 yards from here." 100 yards into the gas? "We have masks," I said, checking the fit of my respirator straps. "The filters are rated for organic vapors and acid gases. They'll hold for a sortie, but we have to be fast." I turned to the tool wall. I needed leverage. Fire door 12 was hydraulic. It was operated by a central pump unit that was currently as dead as the rest of the grid. There was a manual override, a hand pump lever on the control box, but I had not serviced that pump in 3 years. If the seals were dry, it would not build pressure. "Grab the porta-power kit," I ordered. Ramirez hesitated, then stood up. He went to the red metal case on the bottom shelf. The porta-power was a hydraulic body repair kit, a manual hand pump connected by a hose to a hydraulic ram. It was designed for straightening bent car frames, but it was essentially a portable muscle capable of exerting 4 tons of force.
And the pry bars, I added. The big ones, 5-footers. I took a roll of heavy-duty duct tape and wrapped it around my ankles, sealing the cups of my coveralls to my boots. Then I did the same with my wrists and gloves.
It was not a hazmat suit, but it would keep the sludge from touching my skin. "Ramirez," I said, looking him in the eyes through the polycarbonate lens of his mask. "This is going to suck. It's going to be cold. It's going to smell like hell, and it's going to be slippery. But if we do not close that door, we die in this cage. Do you understand?" He nodded. The fear was still there, vibrant and trembling. But he picked up the red metal case. "Let's go." I cut the plastic sheeting with my utility knife. The sound of the blade slicing through the polymer was a sharp hiss. The smell hit us instantly. Even through the filters, I could sense the weight of it. It was not just a smell, it was a texture. The air was thick, oily, and tasted of copper and rot. The H2S concentrations out here were high enough to bypass the activated charcoal's efficiency curve. We stepped out of the cage. The emergency lights in the hallway had died hours ago. The darkness was absolute. My headlamp cut a tight, agitated cone through the gloom. The floor was slick. A thin film of condensation had formed on the salt, turning the ground into ice. We walked toward the old dark. The crunch of our boots was gone, replaced by a wet, slapping sound. 50 yards in, we hit the edge of the sludge. It was black, viscous, and silent. It looked like crude oil mixed with potting soil. It covered the floor from wall to wall, creeping forward at a glacial pace. "Watch your step," I said. "Do not splash it." I stepped into the muck. It was freezing. The cold bit through the leather of my boots instantly. The sludge was heavy, much denser than water. It resisted my movement, sucking at my heels with every step. We waded deeper, ankle deep, shin deep. The junction was ahead. I swept my light across the walls. The salt pillars here were stained dark, the crystalline structure weeping moisture. And there was the door. FD-12. It was a massive slab of steel, 12 feet wide and 10 feet tall, retracted into a pocket in the salt wall. The track ran across the ceiling, a heavy I-beam clogged with decades of dust and grease. "There's the pump." I pointed to a gray metal box mounted on the wall, waist high. We waded over to it. The sludge was nearly at my knees now. I wiped the grime off the pressure gauge. I grabbed the manual pump handle, a steel lever sticking out the side, and gave it a test stroke. It moved freely. Too freely. There was no resistance, no pressure building. "Seals are blown," I spat. "It's bypassing internally." "So we cannot close it?" Ramirez asked, his voice rising in pitch. "We cannot use the built-in system." I looked at the door. I looked at the track. The door hung on rollers. If I could apply force directly to the trailing edge of the door, I could push it shut. "We use the ram," I said. "Get the case open." Ramirez fumbled with the latches of the porta-power case. He set it on a dry-ish ledge of the salt wall, keeping it out of the sludge. He handed me the hydraulic ram, a solid steel cylinder about 6 inches long, and the pump unit. I inspected the door pocket. There was a gap between the back edge of the door and the rock wall of the pocket. About a foot. "I need a spacer," I said. "We need to bridge the gap so the ram has something to push against." I looked around. No wood, no loose rock. "The pry bars," I said. I took one of the 5-foot steel bars. "Hold this against the back wall of the pocket, vertical." Ramirez waded into the recess. The sludge here was deeper, swirling around his thighs.
He planted the bar against the rock. I positioned the hydraulic ram horizontally, sandwiching it between Ramirez's pry bar and the steel edge of the door. "Brace yourself," I warned. "I'm going to load it." I started pumping the handle of the porta-power. Squeeze, release, squeeze, release. The slack in the hose tightened. The ram extended, the steel piston emerging from the cylinder. It made contact. Metal groaned against metal. "It's slipping," Ramirez yelled as the pry bar shifted against the slick salt wall. "Dig it in," I shouted. "Find a crack in the floor." He stomped his boot, jamming the point of the bar into a fissure in the salt. I pumped again. The pressure gauge on the hand pump climbed. 1,000 psi.
2,000 psi. The door groaned, a deep, resonant screech of steel wheels breaking free of rust. It moved. 1 inch. 2 inches. "It's working," I grunted, sweat stinging my eyes inside the mask. I pumped harder. The door slid out of the pocket, creeping across the tunnel opening. 6 inches. A foot. Then the ram topped out. It was fully extended. "Release," I said, twisting the valve on the pump. The pressure hissed and the ram retracted. "We need a longer spacer," I said. "We have to reset." We did it again. We found a discarded piece of pipe in the sludge, debris from the breach, and used it to extend the reach. Pump, screech, slide. We were halfway across. The gap was closing. The flow of sludge through the doorway was accelerating, channeling through the narrowing opening like a river through a canyon. The level was rising against our legs. "Hurry, Elias," Ramirez yelled. "It's coming over my boots. Keep the bar steady." I was pumping rhythmically, my forearm burning. The door was 3 feet from closing. Crack! The sound was sharp and violent. The hydraulic hose, old, brittle rubber, burst. A spray of red hydraulic fluid erupted from the line, painting the white salt wall in a gruesome arc. The pressure vanished instantly. The ram collapsed. The door stopped. "No, no, no," Ramirez stammered. I stared at the severed hose. It was useless. The tool was dead. We had a 3-foot gap. The sludge was pouring through. The gas was pouring through. "The pry bars," I said, throwing the useless pump into the muck. "We do this the hard way. We cannot move that by hand." "Leverage," I snapped. "We have leverage." I jammed the tip of my pry bar onto the leading edge of the door, angling it against the steel track in the floor. "Get your bar," I ordered. "Same spot. We lift and push. We walk it shut." Ramirez jammed his bar next to mine. "On 3. Lift and drive. 1, 2, 3. We heaved. The physics of the fulcrum multiplied our strength. The heavy door hopped slightly on the track and slid forward. 6 inches. Again. Reset. We moved the bars. The sludge was now rushing around the door, the current strong enough to push me off balance. I planted my feet wide, digging my heels into the salt. 1, 2, 3. Heave, slide, screech. 2 feet left. "My mask!" Ramirez yelled. "The filter is wet!" He had splashed sludge onto his facepiece. If the filter paper got saturated, it would stop breathing. He would suffocate. "Do not take it off!" I screamed. "Hold your breath if you have to. We are almost there." 1 foot left. The pressure of the sludge building up behind the door was fighting us now. The liquid was trying to push the door back open. "Last one!" I roared, my voice raw. "Give me everything!" We threw our weight onto the bars. The steel bent under the strain. My boots slipped on the floor, and I fell to one knee, plunging my arm into the toxic muck up to the shoulder. I did not let go of the bar. With a final grinding shriek, the door slammed into the receiving jam. The flow of sludge cut off instantly. The silence returned, sudden and shocking. I knelt there in the dark, my arms submerged, chest heaving. The only sound was the wet gurgle of the sludge settling against the other side of the steel wall. A hungry animal denied its meal. "Latch it," I wheezed. Ramirez scrambled to the locking lever. He threw the heavy steel latch, engaging the locking dogs that would hold the door against the pressure. Clack, thud. Sealed. I stood up, pulling my arm from the sludge. The liquid dripped from my sleeve, thick and black. My skin beneath the coveralls felt hot, a chemical itch starting to bloom. "We need to go," I said. "Decon. Now." We stumbled back down the hallway, away from the door, away from the high concentration zone. We moved faster now, fueled by the adrenaline dump and the burning need to get the poison off us. We reached the cage. I practically fell through the plastic curtain. "Strip," I ordered. "Everything. Outer layer goes in the trash bag. Seal it." We peeled off the sludge-coated coveralls, the tape, the boots. I wiped the black grease from my arm with a rag soaked in solvent from the paint locker. It stung like fire, but the burning stopped. I checked the monitor on the bench. H2S 26 ppm. H2S 24 ppm. It was dropping. The source was cut off. The fan was now slowly scrubbing the residual gas from the room. I slumped against the workbench, my undershirt soaked in sweat. Ramirez sat on the floor, hugging his knees, shivering violently. "We did it," he whispered. "Yeah," I said. I looked at my arm. The skin was red and angry, but intact. I looked at the hydraulic hose on the floor, the red fluid mixed with the black sludge. We had burned our only high-force tool. We had used our energy reserves. But we had bought time. I reached for a water bottle, my hand trembling so much I could barely unscrew the cap. I took a sip. The water was warm and tasted of plastic, but it was the best thing I had ever monitored. Then, the vibration started. It was not a sound at first. It was a tremor in the floor. A low-frequency hum that traveled up through the soles of my feet and into my spine. Ramirez looked up, eyes wide. "Is that the roof?" I placed my hand on the workbench. The tools were rattling. Chink, chink, chink. "No," I said, a strange, impossible hope rising in my chest. "That's not the roof. That's too rhythmic." I stood up and walked to the wall, pressing my ear against the cold salt. Thrum, thrum, thrum. It was a heartbeat. Mechanical. Powerful. "That's a drill," I said. "A heavy-gauge rescue drill." "They're coming?" Ramirez scrambled to his feet. "They're drilling a communication line, or an airline." I checked the time on my watch. It had been 12 hours since the collapse. "They're looking for us," I said. But then the vibration changed pitch. It grew louder, harsher. And then it stopped abruptly with a sickening, grinding tear that echoed through the rock itself. Silence returned. I waited. 1 minute. 2 minutes. Then, a new sound. Not from the rock, but from the pipework overhead. The fire suppression sprinkler line that ran along the ceiling of the maintenance bay. The pipes groaned. The metal contracted. And then, from the sprinkler head directly above the workbench, a single drop of water fell. Plip. Then another. Plip.
I looked up. The pipe was sweating. Not condensation. It was pressurized. The drill hit the aquifer, I whispered. They punched through the equus beds. The equus beds were the massive freshwater aquifer that sat on top of the salt formation. It was the reason the mine had to be so careful. If you pierced the barrier between the salt and the water. The pipe above us gave a lurch. A fine mist of water began to spray from a joint fitting. They did not find us, I said, grabbing the plastic sheeting to cover the battery bank. They just drowned the mine. The water hitting the salt floor was not just wet. It was dissolving the ground beneath our feet. "Get the gear off the floor," I yelled.
Everything high, top shelves. The crisis was not over. The gas was gone, but now the ocean was coming down on our heads. The intrusion of the aquifer was not a torrent. It was a weeping wound in the ceiling of the world. The sprinkler head above the workbench did not burst. It simply failed to hold the pressure of the geological mistake occurring hundreds of feet above us. The seal gave way, and the water came down in a steady, aggressive stream, cold and smelling of limestone and ancient bedrock. "The tarp!" I yelled, my voice cracking against the sudden acoustic violence of the spray. "Grab the heavy visqueen from the paint locker!" Ramirez did not freeze this time. The terror of the gas had burned away his hesitation, leaving a raw, twitchy reflex speed. He scrambled over the workbench, boots slipping on the wet concrete, and tore open the cabinet. He threw the bundle of heavy-duty plastic sheeting at me. I caught it, the material heavy and stiff. "Get the other corner! We need to funnel it!" We unfolded the plastic, stretching it taut beneath the failing pipe. The water hit the sheeting with a heavy, drumming rhythm, the impact vibrating through my arms. It was fresh water. I could smell the difference immediately, the absence of the metallic salt tang. It was the equus beds, the massive reservoir that sat atop the salt formation, draining into our void. "Where do we put it?" Ramirez shouted over the noise. "The drum," I directed, nodding toward a 55-gallon polyethylene drum we used for waste oil. It was empty, cleaned out weeks ago. "Drag it over." Ramirez kicked the drum into position. I used my knife to punch a hole in the center of the sagging plastic sheet, creating a crude drain. The water spiraled down, a vortex of clear fluid disappearing into the blue barrel. It took 10 minutes to rig the permanent solution. We used duct tape and bungee cords to suspend the tarp from the ceiling trusses, creating a permanent hopper that caught the leak and fed it directly into the drum. When we finished, the floor was slick, but the equipment was dry. The immediate chaos settled into a steady, rhythmic drumming sound. It was the cadence of a metronome made of fluid and plastic. I leaned against the chain-link fence, watching the water level rise in the barrel. "Infinite water," I whispered. It was the ultimate irony. In a survival scenario, dehydration is the clock that kills you. We had just smashed that clock, but in doing so, we had started a much larger, darker timer. "Is the roof going to hold?" Ramirez asked. He was wringing out his sleeves, his face pale in the dim light of the emergency lantern. I looked up at the crystalline ceiling. Salt is rock, but it is also a mineral that dissolves. A small leak could carve a cavern over years. A pressurized injection from an aquifer could destabilize a pillar in weeks. "The salt is 600 feet thick." I lied. "It'll take a long time to eat through that. We're fine." But I knew the truth. The structural integrity of Section D was now a variable I could no longer calculate. Time died when the batteries began to fade. We did not have watches anymore. Mine had stopped, and Ramirez's digital display had gone blank to save power. We measured time in voltage. 12.2 volts. The first week, 12.0 volts. The second week, 11.8 volts. The beginning of the decline. We settled into a routine that was less about living and more about mechanical preservation. We were no longer men. We were components of the life support system. My shift was the engineer's watch. I monitored the fan. The carbon filters we had jury-rigged were degrading. The activated charcoal had a saturation point. Once the pores in the carbon were filled with organic molecules, they would stop scrubbing. To extend their life, I established a baking protocol. Every 48 hours, estimated, I would disconnect the battery bank to save power. We would sit in the stagnant silence, breathing shallowly, while I dismantled the filter pack. I would take the charcoal granules and spread them on a steel sheet pan. Using a small propane torch from the plumbing kit, used sparingly, only for seconds, I would heat the bottom of the pan.
The goal was not to burn the carbon, but to heat it enough to drive off the volatile compounds it had trapped. Desorption. It was a delicate, dangerous chemistry experiment performed in the dark. The smell was acrid, like burning hair and sulfur, but it meant the filter would work for another 2 days. Ramirez's shift was inventory and sanitation. He counted the calories. We were down to 800 calories a day. 1 honey bun split in half, 2 handfuls of chips, a single strip of beef jerky. He cataloged every crumb with the obsession of a forensic accountant. He also managed the bucket. The latrine was a 5-gallon pail located at the furthest corner of the cage, behind a privacy screen of cardboard. The rule was absolute. Seal the lid tight. The enzyme packets we found in the RV supply locker helped, but the smell was a constant, underlying note in our symphony of odors. We stopped talking about rescue. The subject was too heavy to lift. Instead, we talked about the machine. "The bearing on the fan is getting louder," I said one morning as I checked the amperage draw on the multimeter. Ramirez was sitting on the floor, sorting M&Ms by color. It was his way of maintaining control. "Is it the dust?" "Yeah. Salt dust is getting into the race. If it seizes, the motor burns out. If the motor burns out, the CO2 pools. If the CO2 pools..." "We sleep forever," he finished, not looking up from his pile of blue candies. "I need to grease it, but we do not have bearing grease." "Use the honey bun glaze," Ramirez said. I looked at him. He was not joking. "It's lipid-based," he murmured, sliding a red M&M into his mouth. "Oil and sugar. Better than dry steel on dry steel." I considered the viscosity. It was insane. It was brilliant. I scraped the sticky, translucent glaze from the surface of a honey bun wrapper. I dismantled the fan housing, exposing the small steel bearing assembly. I packed the sugary sludge into the race. When I powered the fan back up, the high-pitched grinding noise smoothed out into a lower, stickier hum. "Good call," I said. Ramirez did not smile. He just nodded and moved a green candy to the eat pile. 11.5 volts. The darkness became a physical weight. To conserve the lantern batteries, we lived in blackout mode for 16 hours a day. In the dark, the sensory deprivation began to warp the architecture of my mind. The human brain craves input. When it does not get it, it manufactures it. I started hearing the phone ringing. It was not a ringing sound. It was the memory of a ringing sound, played on a loop in the auditory center of my cortex. I would be lying on my makeshift bed of cardboard and bubble wrap, staring at the invisible ceiling, and I would hear the distinct electronic warble of the surface line. I knew it was not real. I had cut the wire myself to use for the fan. But Ramirez heard things too. "Do you hear the scratching?" he whispered one cycle, his voice floating out of the blackness. "It's the salt settling, Ramirez, or the water dripping." "No, it's scratching, like fingernails on the other side of the fire door." I sat up, the rustle of my clothing sounding like an avalanche in the quiet. "The door is sealed. Nothing is on the other side but sludge." "O'Malley is on the other side," he said. The statement was flat, devoid of emotion. "O'Malley is gone. He wants in. He knows we have the fan." "Ramirez, stop. I'm going to open it. I need to tell him we're sorry." The rustle of movement. He was getting up. I launched myself across the dark space. My shoulder collided with his chest, and we went down hard on the concrete. It was not a fight. It was a containment procedure. I pinned him to the floor, my forearm pressing against his collarbone. "You do not touch that door," I hissed, my face inches from where I assumed his was. "You open that door and the gas kills us in 2 minutes. Is that what you want?" He did not struggle. He just wept. It was a dry, heaving sound because we were too dehydrated for real tears, despite the barrel of water. "I just want to see the sun," he choked out. "I know," I said, my grip loosening. "I know. But we have a job."
We have to keep the fan running." "Why?" he asked. "For who?" "For the record," I said. "We are the archivists now. We keep the system running until the shift change." I helped him up. We sat in the dark, shoulder to shoulder, listening to the sticky hum of the fan and the relentless drumming of the water into the barrel. 11.0 volts. The deep discharge curve of the lead-acid batteries was approaching the cliff. Once they dropped below 10.5 volts, the chemistry would collapse. The fan would stop. I had to make a choice. We had the K-tanks of acetylene. We had oxygen. I looked at the blueprint, illuminated by the dying yellow glow of our last lantern. The drill hole. The rescue drill that had pierced the aquifer. It was a 6-inch bore. It was clogged with water, yes, but it was a direct line to the surface. If I could clear the water just for a second, sound would travel. "We're making a cannon," I announced. Ramirez looked at me with sunken, hollow eyes. He had lost 20 pounds. His uniform hung on him like a shroud. "A cannon?" "The pipe that's leaking," I explained, pointing to the ceiling. "It goes up the shaft, connects to the main header, which likely intersects the drill path or runs parallel to it. If the drill hit the pipe chase, that's how the water is getting in." So, if we reverse the pressure, if we send a shock wave up that pipe, it might rattle the casing at the surface. It might blow a geyser out of the drill hole. Someone might see it. It was a desperation play. The physics were shaky, but the alternative was watching the multimeter count down to 0. "How?" "Acetylene," I said. "We fill the drum with an acetylene-oxygen mix. We tape the tarp tight. We use the pipe as the barrel. We ignite it. We'll blow the roof down on our heads. Maybe. Or maybe we ring the doorbell." We spent the day prepping. It took every ounce of remaining energy. We moved the 50-gallon drum directly under the pipe. We emptied the water, precious as it was, onto the floor. I used the duct tape to seal the tarp around the rim of the drum, creating a flexible bladder. I inserted the torch tip into a small slit in the side. "I'm going to fill it," I said. "Acetylene is unstable above 15 psi. We are not pressurizing it. We're just filling the volume. We need a stoichiometric mix. 1 part fuel, 2 parts oxygen." I opened the acetylene valve. The smell of garlic filled the cage,
the chemical odorant added to the gas. I counted the seconds. Then I added the oxygen. The drum became a bomb. I pulled the torch tip out and slapped a piece of tape over the hole. "The igniter," I said. I did not have a fuse. I had the piezo sparker on the torch handle, but I could not be standing next to it when it went off. "We need a remote trigger." I looked at the battery bank. The wire. I stripped a single strand of copper wire, thin as a hair. I wrapped it around the positive and negative leads of a spare 9-volt battery I found in the multimeter case, leaving the circuit open. I buried the wire inside the drum through the tape hole. "When I touch these wires together," I explained, "the thin strand inside glows red hot. It ignites the gas." I ran the lead wire behind the heavy steel workbench. We hunkered down, pulling a welding blanket over our heads. "Ramirez," I said, "if this collapses the room, then we do not have to wait for the voltage to drop," he said. He sounded calm. He was ready. "Right." I held the wire ends. My hands were steady. This was technical execution. This was the job. "Fire in the hole," I whispered. I touched the wires. The world turned white. There was no distinct noise at first, just a physical concussive wave that lifted the atmosphere and slammed it against my chest. The plastic bladder of the drum did not just expand, it vaporized. Then the sound arrived. A thunderclap so loud it bypassed the ears entirely and resonated in the marrow of my bones. It felt like being hit by a train. The shock wave shot up the pipe. Above us, the plumbing groaned. A terrible, rending screech of metal expanding beyond its yield point echoed through the cavern. Then, silence. Dust rained down from the ceiling, coating the welding blanket in a fine white powder. We lay there for a long time. My ears were ringing with a high-pitched whine that drowned out everything else. "Did it work?" Ramirez shouted, though he sounded like he was speaking from the bottom of a swimming pool. I pushed the blanket off. The air was thick with dust and the smell of ozone and burnt plastic. The drum was shredded. The tarp was gone. But the pipe. I shone the dim beam of the flashlight up. The pipe was vibrating. A hollow, rhythmic resonance shuddered through the iron. It was not the sound of water. It was the sound of something striking the metal from a great distance. Strike, 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 strike. SOS. I froze. My heart hammered against my ribs. "Ramirez," I gasped. "Listen." Strike, 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 strike. It was coming from above. Someone was hammering on the drill casing at the surface. They had heard the explosion. They were signaling back. Ramirez burst into tears. Real, sobbing tears this time. He grabbed my arm, his grip bruising. "They know! They know we're here!" I slumped back against the cold concrete. They knew. But knowing was not reaching. The drill was still blocked. The shaft was still dead. The battery bank read 10.8 volts. We had signal. We did not have extraction. I looked at the fan. It was spinning slower now, the pitch dropping to a lazy drone. The air in the cage was already starting to feel heavier, warmer. "They know," I repeated, closing my eyes. The tapping continued. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. It was the rhythm of competence. Someone up there, another tech, another engineer, was swinging a hammer against a pipe, telling us to hold on.
I reached out and adjusted the potentiometer on the fan speed controller, dropping the voltage to the bare minimum needed to turn the blades. "We have to last," I said to the darkness. "We have to stretch the power." I picked up the multimeter. I watched the numbers flicker. We were buried in a salt tomb, 600 feet deep, breathing through a box of burnt charcoal, drinking aquifer runoff, and listening to a hammer tapping a code from a world we could not see. I leaned my head back against the salt wall. "Okay," I whispered. "I'm listening." The tapping went on. Strike. 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 And in the space between the vibrations, I found the stasis. It was not waiting for death. It was holding the line. I was the anchor, and I was not letting go.